Good morning. I want to welcome you to this special event sponsored by the Reformed Institute of Metropolitan Washington. Unlike some classrooms, you are allowed to continue eating, so be my guest. And we will have a break later, so you can get second helpings. My name is Larry Goldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Reformed Institute. I just wanted to share a story briefly I think is relevant to our time. There's a seminary in the region, rather large one, that original motto was a church without a bishop and a land without a king. Very interesting, right? And these were actually Wesleyans, but they were Wesleyans that didn't have bishops. The ongoing centralization of power in our society is something that at least alerts us, and we have to pay attention to. And the Reformed tradition has always been careful about such centralization. And today we will look at alternatives, ways of approaching the state and the nation that have been part of the Reformed tradition. So I welcome all of you, and we're delighted to have you here this morning. Our routine will be similar to our convocations, which one will come again in January. We will alert you to that. The plenary and the discussion will, the plenary will take place first, our address, and we'll take a couple of quick questions for the speaker to ponder over the break. We will have a break. And during the plenary and also during the discussion after the break, you'll be free to write down other questions. And so we're inviting you to write down a question on an index card. That way we can actually organize questions that are similar to one another and have them addressed more thoroughly. So now I'd like to introduce an associate pastor of this fine establishment. Thanks to National Presbyterian Church for hosting us. And we also want to hear from a member of our board, Reverend Dr. Quinn Fox.
So glad that you are here. For anyone who has picked up a newspaper, a few of us still do that, or read, watched, or listened to news on a screen or on a device, it's difficult to miss the reality that we live in a time when waving the flag and raising the cross, for some Americans, are inseparable. They go hand in hand. But which one should be raised higher? Which one takes priority? Should Christians offer patriotic support or prophetic critique of the state in a time such as the one that we are living? It seems that that's a moving target. And if it doesn't move hourly, it certainly moves almost daily. Those shaped and formed by the Reformed theological tradition have engaged nations and the state in different ways over the course of time, always asking, what does God call my country, my state, to be? And to help us think more thoughtfully and pray more faithfully, we've invited a fellow traveler and faithful guide, Dr. Mark Valeri. Mark is the Reverend Priscilla Neaves Distinguished Professor of Religion and Politics at Washington University, where he is finishing up being the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. I was thinking last night, Mark, that I think that John Danforth has a partial history here at National. And I think he was instrumental in starting one of our old Sunday school classes with Louis Evans' wife, Colleen. I looked online, and the name of the class is Wrestlers, and the Google AI said that John C. Danforth had never had a wrestling career, and that he was an Episcopal priest now, not a Presbyterian. Sometimes it can be very helpful, and sometimes not so helpful. Anyway, Mark has been at Washington University since moving from Richmond, where he was a professor of church history at Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And so in 2012, we were able to get him to come up here just down the road. And so it's great to welcome you back to this place. And then even longer ago than that, you spoke at something for the Reformed Institute. So those with a long institutional memory may remember Mark from that. His areas of specialization include religion, social thought, and economics in America, Reformation theology and the political history of Calvinism, Puritanism, and Enlightenment moral philosophy. Mark's most recent book describes how Protestant views of other religions changed between 1650 and 1765. That's sort of his sweet spot, and so he's, I guess, forging new territory here as he's looking at 21st century phenomena. But the name of that book is The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embrace Religious Liberty. His book, Heavenly Merchandise, How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America, published by Princeton University Press in 2010, received the 2011 Philip Schaff Prize from the American Society of Church History. He's currently working on the topic of religious persuasion, evangelicalism, and secularism in the 18th century, except when he does side gigs like this to talk about our contemporary situation. Mark is an ordained minister in the PCUSA. He earned his BA from Whitworth College, now university, in a fine Presbyterian school, where our son Jonathan graduated from, and a variety of folks who have been through National. He earned an MDiv from Yale Divinity School, and then went on to do a PhD in American Religious History at Princeton University. Mark, it is great to have you here this morning. Welcome to the Reformed Institute and to Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to National Press and thanks to the Reformed Institute to invite me to reflect with you on this incredibly timely issue of our religious identity, our political identity, and I don't think it's inappropriate to have a historian, because many of the claims being made in the news, one direction or the other, is that the United States somehow has fallen in the past few decades from a period in which it was resolutely in a better shape and more Christian, and we've sort of succumbed to secularism and all sorts of agendas that stand against Christianity. And that claim that we have fallen from a place where we once revered the nation from a Christian perspective is a historical claim. And so I want to go back over the history and talk with you a few minutes about the Reformed perspective on Christian attitudes towards the nation. It has to do with religious liberty on the one side, but there are so many topics, believe me. I don't know how many months ago I was asked to do this, but in the meantime, my newspaper inbox, my email inbox has been, it seems like it just changes almost every day, and the new issues come up. So mine is only one approach among many. I understand that, so I look forward to the conversation after the questions and answers in the conversation to fill out a lot of questions that we have. What do I mean by the Reformed perspective? I think that if you were to take Reformed theology in the modern period as a whole, you would say Reformed thinkers take Scripture as authoritative, but Reformed people understand Scripture as ambiguous when it comes to certain modern questions. The Reformed people are often very good biblical exegetes and take the Bible as a text which cannot be easily squeezed into predetermined categories, but we need to read that text. It is authoritative in a very contextual manner. And most Reformed thinkers admit that if we were to talk about something like Christian religious nationalism or Christian patriotism, it's a little awkward because there are no nation states when the Bible is written. There are countries, there are places like ancient Israel, but there are huge empires whose borders change. And so the notion that the Bible speaks directly, concretely to our attitude towards a nation state isn't quite lucidly, obviously clear, which is why Reformed theology steps in and says, we are the ones who are really good at solving the ambiguities and figuring out. I said to a class at my church in St. Louis a while ago that what theologians do is they take the ambiguities of Scripture, things that sound very different on the surface. We are saved by faith. Faith must be a matter of works. And all these different questions, what theologians do is they put those on the surface, contradictory biblical affirmations, and work them out. That's what theology is. So, my thesis is the way Reformed theologians have worked on the issue of Christian patriotism is that patriotism, love for one's fellow citizens and country, is a mandate. It is an important calling, but it is bounded. It is not ultimate. It is bounded, especially because Reformed people are very appreciative of the biblical doctrine of sin. And that if we read you know that you begin your worship service in Reformed tradition with a confession of sin. And Reformed people who've thought about this nation, the American nation, have not been shy about beginning with the notion of critique and sin. Because it's a theological mandate. That's not a political position, it's a theological position. So that's my thesis, and let's jump in first of all with some definitions, terms. What do we mean by Christian patriotism? And we have to, at the start, set it off against what's called religious nationalism. Even nationalism itself, what do we mean by nationalism? It can be used in a very loose sense. Nationalism is being patriotic, recognizing that the United States historically has a lot of Christians in its origins, that its language has always been tied to especially Protestant Christian language, that there have been religious influences on our history, on the revolution itself, on the making of our laws and our civic culture. That's a loose sort of sense of patriotism, that we owe gratitude and deference to this nation, but that's a little different from Christian nationalism. Political theorists, political scientists actually define nationalism in a very particular way. It focuses on the nation state, as the goal of history. It is the real, absolute context, the social organization that's the highest social organization and that demands our ultimate choices of life and death, that we are identified as belonging to a nation, and that's our deep identity. And this version of nationalism, that the nation is the goal of history, that it's the key to human flourishing, you can see it in some of the language. And his political scientists sort of tag this to the early 19th century German thinker Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. I'm sure you've heard the name Hegel, who wrote those very things, that the nation is the goal of history, that the nation is the place where humans find their true identity and flourishing. And Hegel wrote, of course, when his Germany was not yet a nation. It was a collection of principalities, each with their own claims to sovereignty. And he wrote at a time in which he was trying to put Germany together as a nation with a people group that had the same language, the same ethnic background, who would set aside their differences of different principalities, Saxony or Prussia, and find themselves German. He also wrote he wrote a lot about Greece as something that used to be a nation that had been divided up by the Ottoman Empire and was no longer a single nation, and he wanted these people groups to find their identity and national sovereignty. So from Hegel, people say that's when nationalism really begins. This sense that this thing we belong to called a nation state is a people group with a single language, that it has the same culture and sometimes even ethnic identity. And the implications of this kind of nationalism are that all nations have fixed and well-defined and defended borders. That national power, this is probably the most important point, that national power is a worthy moral and political goal. Power is not a negative thing, it's a positive thing, and it always should be that dynamic towards which the state moves, and so it is quite natural for leaders in this nationalist vein to aspire to and to promote power for the nation. As a result, international relations are always a contest. It's always a competition for power and prestige rather than, let's say, a means of cooperation to solve international dilemmas or problems such as famine or disease. So when you hear in contemporary political discourse, a particular nation ought to be first, and that nation is leading the world, and it ought to pursue policies for its own power, and it ought to pursue policies irregardless of, it should not give away power to international groups, that comes out of a kind of Hegelian 19th century perspective. That's what we mean by nationalism. In America, the history of nationalism isn't, there's no straight line. We were not built with nationalist assumptions. It's actually a fairly recent development in the long term of history. Most historians say that this nationalist language, that we are a single people with a largely the same ethnic identity, largely the same religious convictions, or at least moral substrates, that we need to make ourselves into a nation emerged in the Civil War. The Civil War was a fight for nationhood. In 1861, there was no nation. There was sectional rivalries and war. The South, the North, and the unclaimed territory towards what today we would think of is the Midwest, right? So the Civil War is a fight for nationhood, to bind this all together. And it is in that period in which the language, the Hegelian language of peoplehood, of absolute meaning and purpose, of being bound together in our chief identities and the goal of our life together is this nation, emerges, interestingly enough, especially amongst northern thinkers who are trying to unify the nation, and who look especially to New England, which is the Plymouth Rock myth, the city on the hill language, all comes to the fore during the Civil War from northern political writers who say, we have a sacred calling. A lot of it's tied to a morally very admirable cause, the abolition of slavery. But that moral cause begins to take on a divine sanction and a divine aura to it, and then it gets blended into nationhood. And so American nationalism in this sense doesn't come from the period of the Revolution. It comes from the period of the Civil War. And that's why New England is fastened on as the kind of the birthplace of America. Puritans and their religious identity, their thick religion, seems to be a place of identity formation. That kind of nationalism is a little subordinated after the Depression and during the Second World War and the Cold War. That language sort of moves away in those periods, partly because the Second World War was waged against Italian and German fascism, which took nationalism, the power of the state, to an extreme measure. And therefore, nationalism was not a very attractive mindset during the Second World War. One does not see a lot of it, that the goal of history is the nation and nations ought to fight with each other to be first, because that was the mindset of the fascists. And that's why that word gets thrown around a lot today, obviously too loosely on both ends of the political spectrum. But it also doesn't, nationalism also isn't very strong during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, what the United States is doing is trying to form an international alliance. NATO is very important. And the notion that all of history centers on a particular nation being first and being powerful goes to the background because we're trying to form an international NATO alliance. And so the language isn't very strong in the Cold War. But it has emerged recently. And the question political scientists ask is, why now? Why are we in this period where there's an extremely strong religious nationalism, making the state almost divine, that God has a purpose for this nation unlike any other nation? Why now? And what political scientists they don't have it figured out fully, but where they're moving toward is it's a reaction against globalism and international corporations and global capitalism and a sense of loss of identity, since we're not going to merge and lose our borders and be sort of subsumed into this large world order. You'll see that talk sometimes, but that's the context in which the mandate to reaffirm one's national identity and the purpose of nation is the strongest. So there are a lot of contemporary groups. I'm almost done with the religious nationalism part. And I'm going to get to the good stuff in just a minute. But we need to keep this in mind. A lot of contemporary groups of Christian nationalists that see the American nation as the key to the history and that see the cultural heritage and identity of America as Christian, and especially Protestant Christian. That we are distinct people with a group, as a group with a heritage, and even though, and this is what Christian nationalists say, even though you as an individual, your individual family may not be Christian, Protestant Christian, you belong to a nation which at its roots as a people group is. And so they're not calling out individuals to become Christian, but they are saying is the nation as itself ought to identify with this religious tradition to shape up its identity and its strength. Christian practices and ideas ought to promote and shape our common life. The government ought to promulgate Christian ideas. The government ought to. And the church ought to promulgate nationalist ideas. These two things are bound together. And most of all, American power is a good thing. It is a godly thing. 65% of Americans in a recent poll have claimed that being a Christian is integral to being an American citizen, even though one's personal beliefs are irrelevant. It's the claim to being a Christian as a sort of historical identity that 65% of Americans say is important to American citizenship. There's different movements. You may have heard of Catholic integralism, which claims there ought to be a control over moral, social, political, artistic, academic issues because the Christian teaching is true. Or Protestant dominionism, the Seven Mountains mandate, that Christians ought to take control of the 7 large clusters of social and political activity, education. I don't have the 7 memorized, thank goodness, but health, education, science, politics. The Christians ought to take control of those because Christians have truth. And there are some writers who don't go that far, but who hint in this direction. Samuel Huntington, the journal First Things has become religiously nationalist in the last decade. The journal, The National Review. This language is beginning to come up. To be American is to not to be ashamed of the Christian heritage and background, to embrace it and use it to inform and shape our common policies. So that when the state of Arkansas and Louisiana mandated the 10 Commandments ought to be placed in public schools, and Texas is now debating that issue right now, it is a sort of popularized version of this religious nationalism. Or I can cite a Christian singer. Has anyone ever heard of Natasha Owens? Okay, count yourselves fortunate. Natasha Owens is a very well-known Christian singer in certain circles. She has performed a lot at Mar-a-Lago. And this is what she said. This is a quote direct. "I can't look at the flying flag without tearing up. It's the same way for me when I see a cross. We all of our freedom to the military men and women. Freedom is the most expensive thing that we own, and we have not earned it." And so this amazing melange of cruciform Jesus talk, the cross, and the American military and the affections that it draw from us, just sort of blended together without much lapse. I love the flag, I love the cross, and they go together and teach me who I am. So that's a kind of a version of religious nationalism, Christian nationalism. How does Christian, by the way, theologically, those who espouse Catholic integralism, Protestant dominionism, the 7 Mountains mandate, tend not to be Reformed people. They tend to be people who believe in a divine revelation after Scripture, which means they're either Roman Catholic, conservative Catholic integralism, who believes that God reveals God's self in the development of thought about nations and history beyond Scripture, or Protestant, charismatic, Pentecostally oriented people who have visions and dreams about our current political figures and state of action. So notice that I began by saying the Reformed people are accountable to this text, the text of Scripture, and deal with it honestly, and that which puts bounds on nationalist thinking. And the people who are claiming high levels of Christian identity for the nation or national identities for the church are those who think that there's this revelation past Scripture, either Catholic or charismatic. So what's Christian patriotism in contrast to this? Well, it is a devotion. It is devotion to the country. The word patriotism comes from the Latin word patria, which means fatherland or ancestral home. The term came into being actually in Great Britain. Patriotism came into being in Great Britain in the 1720s and 30s when there was a series of what we call the Jacobite rebellions, people who were Roman Catholic and who wanted a different line of monarchs on the throne of England. And during those Jacobite rebellions, a group of British leaders say, no, we ought to be loyal to the nation as it is, and they coined the word patriotism. By the way, they wrote the song, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britain, Britain, Britain never will be slaves. And when the Union Jack, the English flag as we know it today, was constructed and made. So there's this outburst of patriotic, that's where the word patriotism comes from. It means, in its best tradition, a care for one's fellow citizens, a sense that you do belong to more than your individual families or your individual interest groups or even your political parties. It has some tie to what sociologists call civil religion. Saying the Pledge of Allegiance, treating the flag properly, singing the national anthem, a sense in which we belong together and we have these different affections because we belong together under this rubric of nationhood. That civil religion was at its height in the 1950s. The phrase, "In God we trust," was put on coins then, and the Pledge of Allegiance included the God language in the 1950s, sort of a civil religion that wasn't really theological and based in any one church. It was just this sense that we belong to more. It's not especially exceptionalist. It doesn't say America is an exceptional nation. This kind of patriotism is quite happy to see other nations prosper. It doesn't think that America should be first. It thinks that America should be good. And the leader on the world stage because it's good, not that it's first or most powerful. And most importantly, it's self-critical. That a genuine kind of patriotism then regards the nation with esteem because it's love for one's fellow citizens, but it doesn't regard the nation as the goal of history or power is in and of itself a worthy goal of national activities, and it does not regard the United States as a particularly exceptionalist nation. How does Reformed theology or teaching fit into this? Dealing with the mixture of biblical texts. Tomorrow morning I'm doing a Sunday school class here. We'll get into a little more on the biblical text. I want to touch on some Reformed thinkers and what they thought about patriotism and nationalism. And I'll start with, who would you think I would start with? John Calvin, good choice. I do actually really love the writings of John Calvin, and it came to me when I was a student at Yale Divinity School, and we had an Old Testament class. These are Yale scholars. I mean, they're the highest level of biblical scholarship. And one of my teachers, whose name was Brevard Childs, said to all of us students who were studying for the ministry, don't bother going out and buying a lot of commentaries. Just buy Calvin. Calvin's commentary is on the Bible. This is a Yale Divinity School in the 90s, so I have high regard for our brother John Calvin. His overall perspective in his writing was that God did rule in history. God ruled through institutions, but God's rule in history was designed to safeguard the believing community, the church. And all national affairs were subordinate to that. The preaching of the gospel was the real means that God ruled the world. That being Calvin's perspective, he wasn't really a super patriot. The text with which he had to deal and where he wrote about this, so this is the one Bible text we'll do with a little bit this morning, is from 1 Peter chapter 2. Be subject to the Lord, this is Peter, be subject to the Lord's, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So Calvin wrote a lot about this. Calvin, as you know, spent most of his career in the Swiss city-state of Geneva, which was an independent city-state. But about 2 miles from Geneva is the nation of France. And Calvin actually was a subject of the King of France until the last 2 years of his life. It was only then that the Genevans finally let him become a citizen of Geneva. But he was a subject of the King of France, and so he had to deal with the fact that there's this French king who really is not warm towards the Reformation because he's Catholic. And Calvin has to deal with the First Peter text. And so he writes a letter to Francis I, or he would say as Francois Premier. And he writes a letter to him and includes it in the front of Calvin's 1560 edition of his great theological work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And this is what he said to Francis. I honor you. You are the king. You are my king. Still a subject of France. However, and then he says, and don't fear the Reformation. We're not here to overthrow your government. We're here just to worship God the way we think best. So don't fear the Reformation. Yes, there are a lot of crazy radical reformers, Anabaptists, and little sectarian movements running around with pitchforks in their hands, but that's not us. In fact, he kind of implies, you can go ahead and kill them. But don't fear the Reformed Church. And he says, towards the end, he says, in fact, you ought to be really careful not to persecute the Reformed Church because, and this is Calvin's quote, the living God has appointed Christ to rule from sea to sea. It's quoting Psalm 72. Not any earthly monarch. The Christian ought to, quote again Calvin, embrace the whole human race in a single feeling of love, making no distinction between political friend and enemy, since every person should be contemplated in God, not in themselves. So he basically says to Francis, here's our teaching on politics. We love all human beings as they are contemplated in God. We honor you. There's a sense in which Calvin says about 1 Peter, yeah, there's honor the emperor talk, but it comes at the end. It comes after honor everyone, love the brotherhood, and fear God. And at the end, yeah, honor the emperor. Don't make yourself trouble. Don't become agitated and revolutionary, sort of get yourself thrown in jail for no good reason. That's Calvin's attitude. It's not highly patriotic. It means, yes, we belong to nation states, and you should recognize that. And be good citizens, but that's about it. That make sense? That's Calvin. I'll jump ahead to the... How are we doing on time? All right? Can I go a few more minutes? All right. I'll take it all. The Puritans, some of my favorite people. Reformed thinkers, English-speaking Reformed thinkers, initially in England. They're obviously not very patriotic either because they live semi-unfavored lives under an English monarch who is not Reformed, but who's the head of the Church of England. And so they don't write a lot of patriotic stuff. What about when they settle New England? Well, they begin to talk about God has a special purpose for New England, but the more they talk like that, the worse it sounds for New England, because this is what they say. God has a special purpose for New England. It's a colony. It's obviously not a nation yet. But that means you have special obligations, which means when things go bad, you're probably responsible for them. So there happens in the 1660s, 1670s, a series of bad misfortunes for New England, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Really bad, harsh winters, the freezing time they called it, followed by bizarrely dry, drought-filled summers, followed by and accompanied by lots of storms and shipwrecks at sea, the high period of piracy off the coast of America is in this period, in addition to which increasingly violent conflicts with indigenous Americans. So things were not going well for New England in the 1650s, 60s, and 70s. And the Puritan preachers said this: well, you have a high calling from God, don't you? That means God will punish you all the more. Our job is to expose, as preachers, to expose your sin and to expose the reasons for your misfortunes. And they preached sermons after the manner of the prophet Jeremiah, because that's a summary of the prophet Jeremiah, and those sermons were called Jeremiads. Things are going bad, and our job as preachers is to point out how things are going bad, and it's your own sinfulness that is making things going bad. The sin of New England, according to them, was that they'd become very, very greedy, avaricious, pursuing their own financial well-being to the detriment of their poorer neighbors, and that was the basic sin that they landed on. So the Puritans weren't actually strong religious nationalists. I want to talk about one of my favorite other Reformed thinkers, Jonathan Edwards. Edwards, writing in the 1720s, 30s, 40s, was a loyal member of the British Empire. Britain was fighting France at the time in a series of international wars, a lot of it on American soil, the quote-unquote French and Indian Wars. And Edwards was rooting for Britain to win. And so he has some kind of patriotic language in there. But then towards the end of his life, he writes a book called The Nature of True Virtue. I love that book by Jonathan Edwards. This is what he says. He's arguing that people ought to become Christians, but this is the way he argues, is we all agree that we ought to be virtuous and seek virtue and love virtue, moral good. We all would agree that the selfish, most contained virtue of moral good is love towards self. That's not a great virtuous thing. It's kind of inevitable and natural, love of self. Love of family is just an extension of that. He has a very interesting part where he talks about love of one's family. It's a good thing. It's not especially virtuous because your family is just an extension of you. So don't get all sort of satisfied like, well, I love my family. Then he says, he's not putting that down. He's just saying, let's go beyond that. More love is love towards one's interest group, party, affiliation, neighborhood. That's a little better because you're getting more love to more people, and to one's nation is actually a really good thing. And that's a Christian version of patriotism. Love to one's nation and one's fellow citizens beyond your narrow interest group is a really good Christian thing. It's a biblical thing. And Edwards says, but we're only halfway there to virtue. What's better than that? Love towards all of humanity is a higher calling than love towards one nation. And he says, but there's one more place to go. The greatest virtue is love towards the source of all being itself, which is love towards God. You just get this sense that Edwards is thinking, patriotism, it's better than just being a little self-contained family unit, but it isn't anywhere close to this love of the source of all being itself. And then towards the end, he says, well, how does one love God? Well, one must have a taste, a feeling, a sentiment for God. God must enter your life and bring you over to that position. I clearly like Edwards. I'll push on towards Reinhold Niebuhr. I'm going to talk about the American Revolution tomorrow morning, so I'll skip that period. Reinhold Niebuhr, this period of the Cold War that I was talking about at the beginning, Niebuhr writes in a really interesting book called The Irony of American History. He writes it in 1952 at the beginning, sort of the Cold War is coming into shape, that period. Niebuhr's really good on politics, I think. His theology lacks sometimes, but he's really good on politics. Favorite author of, do you know which two American presidents? Recent ones? Obama's who I had in mind, but also who else? Carter, Jimmy Carter, that's it, thank you. Carter and Obama, interestingly, the two very, very explicitly Christian presidents of the late 20th century, both loved Reinhold Niebuhr. This is what Niebuhr said, that American history is an irony. The height of irony is reached by the fact that the most powerful nation in the alliance of free peoples is the United States, a nation which in its power grew to phenomenal proportions. And here's why it's ironic. The United States has great power, and of course he's thinking of nuclear power at the time, and its chase for nuclear power. And this is what he says. As the United States begins to do that as a defense of freedom, but like all nations, once it begins to gain power, it will take power as its own end, its own purpose. And nations begin to drive themselves towards the accumulation of power for its own sake. And he says that's very non-theological. That's not a biblical position. That nations who say, my goal is power, because nations are like that. Once you exist and you have power, you'll think that maintaining that power is the whole purpose of your nation. As he says, this is Niebuhr, all nations, unlike some individuals, lack the capacity to prefer a noble death to a morally ambiguous survival. All nations, unlike some individuals, lack the capacity to prefer a noble death to a morally ambiguous survival. And I thought, when I read this, I thought, Niebuhr's right, that from a theological perspective, guess what? The United States will not live forever. It will die someday. And we need to keep that in mind as a theological affirmation, even though we love our fellow citizens. There are contemporary thinkers on Christian patriotism. Richard Mouw, M-O-U-W, past president of Fuller Seminary, has a really interesting book. He's actually a little more patriotic than I am. He loves flags and ceremonies and sporting events and love of neighbor, and I think all of that's good. I grew up in Los Angeles in the 1960s, in the middle of the Vietnam War. And in my first years in college, in the Watergate scandal. And as I was a child, I grew up in Los Angeles, the Watts riots, and soldiers patrolling the streets of LA, shooting people. So my feeling about the nation, I'm not like taken by patriotism. Could be a lack, but it has something to do with where I grew up and when I grew up. But I'll tell you the two places where I felt most patriotic. Well, first of all, I think theologically we ought to be grateful for what we have. And being grateful for to the giver of gifts for gifts that we have not earned or merited, but have just been given is a very theologically sound thing. So there are times in which I'm grateful for being protected, for my freedom, for abundance, for health care, for roads and safe travel, for schools, for our jobs, which often, until the last week, relied on government institutions for research, parks and museums. I think gratitude for that is a really important thing. But I also have been moved. I'll tell you the two occasions where I've been most moved. First of all, my first book that I wrote was on religion and the American Revolution. And I finally went, and I'd been doing research in Philadelphia on it, and I finally went to the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which is the room in which the Declaration of Independence was debated and signed. So the Second Continental Congress is meeting, and you walk inside this room, and it's not very big. It's smaller. It's about half the size of this room here. And there's all these 18th century desks, just like it was during the debates and signing of the Declaration, with little inkwells and some 18th century books on it. And I walked inside this room, and there was no one else there. And I was overcome. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Witherspoon. These people did that right here. And I felt very patriotic. The second time was when I was in Richmond and I took a train up here to attend the first inauguration of Barack Obama. And I was very lucky. Tickets were very hard to come by for that. And through some connections, I had good seats. And I'll tell you what got me at that moment. I mean, I was very grateful and ecstatic at the election of an African American to be the president of the United States, one whose politics I tended to agree with. But here's the thing that got me, is when he finished taking the oath, they fired off cannons that represented the peaceful transition of power from one president to another. And that got me. Wow, a nation which can do this just blew me away. So, final conclusions then. This is what I think a Reformed perspective teaches us about Christian patriotism. It ought not to be religiously nationalistic. It ought to say the following things. It ought to be based on self-critique. That it is a patriotic thing to critique your country, your nation, and to find out what's wrong with it. That's a very Reformed thing to do. Historian of Puritanism named Perry Miller wrote, America's white Christian ethno-religious, Perry Miller wrote, the one thing that Americans have to export that is of value is the tendency to self-doubt. Self-doubt is our best thing we can export to other nations. I think that's an important point. The second thing I take away from Reformed tradition is that we ought to focus on international, worldwide Christian movements and communities. We ought to have an international identity. We ought to think of ourselves as more than Americans, but as belonging to this international movement that's called the Christian community. So bound your patriotism with a sense of critique, with the sense that you belong to this universal human community. Dana Roberts, a famous missiologist from Boston University, she gave this talk about how when Christian missionaries moved into Africa in the late 19th century, one of the things that it did is encourage national independence movements in these African nations. And I got the sense, oh yes, I had to be rooting for those nations as well, and not just this nation. American exceptionalism doesn't accord well with Reformed theology. The notion that we are an exceptionally virtuous, powerful nation to which all of history is moving. I think that's not very Reformed. I think Reformed perspective is we save that language for the kingdom of God and the gospel of Jesus. So the best way we can do this is keep learning, keep reading, and keep thinking. What should I do now, Quinn? Larry.
Briefly introduce two people who are going to gather question cards Valeri and DLC, would you come up, please? They're helping us today for the Institute. And Valeri, I just had the pleasure of meeting around CUA and a student there. And DLC is a colleague, Presbyterian pastor, who is in transition and looking for a new calling. So these two, if you do have a question card, please gather them for us, would you? And we will, I think given the time, I don't know, what do you think, Quinn? Should we pick one?
Oh, I have one if you want to take it.
Well, there you go. There you go. The host gets the privilege of, but please hold up a card if you have one. We have a couple here. And continue writing, and we'll gather them.
Questions and comments.
So,
Mark, in your beginning comments, you were talking about what I'm going to broadly describe as a narrative of decline and loss. That it used to be there were good old days and we want the good old days back. When I was first introduced to the study of American religion, I learned all about the narratives of decline in the context of colonial New England. So the narratives of decline has been a theme throughout American history, and I'm curious, and this is to be answered, I suppose, after the break. Is that a trend, or are the narratives of decline in the earlier parts of our country's history somehow different than the current narratives of decline and loss?
great. Now, we're going to answer this after bagels?
Yeah.
Is that right? You just want to make sure you got it, Dr. Valeri. Very good. One more question that Dr. Valeri can be thinking about that you'd like to share. Okay. That's all right. That's all right. We'll remember. Thank you.
So I'm Bill Bennett from National Presbyterian Church, and the question I wrote on the card was, how do you define power as you use that term in your discussion of nationalism?
Mark mentioned that he'll be here tomorrow for the adult Sunday school class. I realize that many of you will not be here tomorrow, and you're probably wondering, well, gee, what about us? Not to worry. We'll record it, and then we will post it on our website, and if we can get our act together, Larry, we'll send out an email to all of the attendees here and everyone who has pre-registered with a link to that,
Yes.
so that you can watch it as early, I think, as tomorrow afternoon. Of course, if you don't have plans for tomorrow morning, we'll be here at 9:55 on the topic of how should we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country. Anyway, that's the rest of the story on
Great.
Mark's weekend.
Thank you. We do have an online audience today, and we welcome questions from them as well. And I think Yvonne McKinney is hosting that down from Georgia, and she can gather those for us as well. So let's take a 10-minute break. Thank you. And there is a lot more food, so please help yourself. Answer from there, and I'll just field some questions. We have two questions to begin with, and I'm just going to turn that over. One was regarding power, yes? No?
One was a power, one was on decline.
And the other, the narratives of decline and definitions of power.
So the narratives of decline, of course, are that whatever period we're in, we're at a worse period than we were before, and that we've declined. And part of the language of Christian nationalists is re-injecting a lot of Christian identity in rules and teaching into schools, into public discourse, into speeches, into laws in some cases. that this will help reverse a decline. I don't like the decline narrative because it implies there was a golden age that was really, really good. And I'm hard-pressed to find what that golden age was. The Puritans did use language of decline, and what they were talking about was the original first immigration of English immigrants to the New World through 1630 were very, very devoted people, or they wouldn't have made that trip. It was a 6-week to 3-month voyage where you were seasick every single day on these little ships. I mean, they wrote about, I'm not making that up. They wrote about that. And so you had to be really dedicated to move to New England. And so the Puritans talked about a decline from the first generation into this kind of worldly, now we're all into money and trade, but that's sort of a minimal sense of this amazing first generation, which were sacrificing a lot to move over here. So that kind of decline, it makes a little sense, but contemporary explanations of decline imply decline from what? Are we declining? The second question on power, define power and nationalism. That is a really good question. Well, obviously, what first comes to mind is military power, right? And so if you heard anything of the recent meeting of 800 generals and admirals and the Secretary of Defense speaking to them, was this last week, I think? You know, there was a lot of image there of power as being military power. And when Niebuhr wrote the power that he so frightened him was military and nuclear power, but also economic power, power to make treaties, to control people's destinies by large-scale economic decisions, whether they have to do with NAFTA, opening up international trade, or whether it has to do with tariffs closing down international trade. So that one senses that power is economic, power is military, were the two things that came most to my mind. Was there something else that came to your mind?
No, I was just curious.
So how would, the question was, the comment was, how do contemporary theologians, Reformed theologians define power in such terms? Did I catch that right? And I think it is military, I think it is economic, I think it also has to do with the social power, the power of exclusion, the power of, when, this was in Seattle, when a high school football coach was there praying with their football players on the field, either before or after games, there was some language in the suit that was brought against the school district for allowing this football coach to do that. The language was a little bit of the power of a secret coerciveness to that. That strikes me as a little weak, but I mean, I get it. It's a little weak. I'm thinking of power in these terms. And I think many of the Reformed theologians of the 1950s, Niebuhr, even European ones, Barth, I'm going to mention Oscar Kuhlmann, the New Testament theologian tomorrow. They thought nations were not blessings, nations were threats to the Christian church. So I need to think further. That is a really good question. What we think of as about power, I think we should think very suspiciously of it.
Okay. We're going to enter, it's like the lightning round here, Dr. Valeri. You get 2 minutes to answer a question.
Got it. Okay. I got it.
Okay, so 2 minutes, yeah. Somebody want to time him? Yeah, and go ding. Okay, here's a quote from, Mark Twain. Patriotism is supporting one's country all the time and the government when it deserves it.
I kind of like that. I think there's some wisdom to that. I'll leave it at that. In other words, what that's getting at is loving one's country, one's fellow citizens, one's belonging to. Simone Weil, the French writer who converted to Christianity from a Jewish upbringing and didn't particularly like her native country, France, very much. But towards the end of the Second World War, she said, I began to realize I belonged to France in a good way. And that sense of belonging was really important to her. And I think Twain's saying that kind of patriotism is a good thing, but we ought to do it with being able to stand back and critique the government. And that has to do with power too. Critiquing power and critiquing the government where it violates our sense of norms for godly, humane, affirming stuff.
Okay, good. Two questions about Christian nationalists. I'll put them together, so you get 3 minutes. Christian nationalists in this view, that some of the leaders do not have serious connections with the church or spiritual background, A. B, how do we counter the narrative of the far-right Christian nationalists?
Yes, many Christian nationalists are not particularly religious. I don't want to, I told myself I'm not mentioning names of political leaders, which I will refrain to do, but they easily come to mind. People who have a nationalist view but don't know what religion really means or is. What was the second part of it?
Well, generally, how do we counter, as Reformed Christians, counter the narrative Christian nationalists?
I think that is a gorgeous, beautiful question. We need to be always constructing counter-narratives that point to places where, this is from Augustine. Remember Augustine, way back when? Augustine said we ought to view history as this flow of largely selfish, violent events in which divine love breaks through and penetrates. And look for those moments of the breaking through of divine love into our history. Places where we just said yes. And I think we need to think about those narratives more and more.
Okay. Here's a question about, in this person's view, the rise of fascism. Is America's extreme individualism psychologically unsustainable, A? And B, is fascism a relief to this trend?
One more time.
Given American individualism, perhaps unsustainable, is fascism some kind of answer to that problem?
Yes, and I'll tell you why I think extreme individualism is unsustainable is I think we're social creatures and we are actually not individuals. And what I try to actually tell my students a lot who want to be individuals is I say, everyone take out your iPhone. And they all do. And I say, you're really individuals? You are, that what we think of as individualism is often a capitulation to a commercialized culture, and we sell ourselves to many different masters. And so I think that individualism is not that much of a threat. I think the threat is the different kinds of forces that impinge upon us and ask for our allegiance, loyalty, and what we often think of as individualism is simply going along with a commercialized, hyper-capitalistic culture which turns us into mere consumers in a system. Second part of that was
Fascism.
Fascism is in a sense a relief from that, because we know these forces, these impersonal forces that impinge upon our lives. They could be racialized forces, they could be commercialized forces, they could be economic forces, and we people who are attracted to fascist thought about the hyper power of the nation and the super hyper patriotism, I do think that brings a sense of belonging that is an escape from that.
Okay.
It's a dangerous one, but I think that's true.
Okay, good. Some questions about empire. And as and its collusion with nationhood. Okay, if the United States is or has can be considered an empire from the beginning, this is the question. How does that influence our understanding of patriotic duties as citizens in the United States? In other words, how much has an imperial notion of the United States kind of shaped or infected, I don't know if that's the point of view here, our understanding of Christian patriotism?
Many historians point out that after the Declaration of Independence, after the Treaty of Paris 1783 that made the United States an independent nation, that imperial designs really filtered through. Pennsylvania was a colony in a British Empire until 1783. They knew imperial structures. They knew that what empire means is you have a metropole, a center capital with a central nation, but the job of an empire is to extend beyond seas and to extend beyond the oceans or extend one's territory as far as possible. That's what empire is. And to put bureaucrats there, to put that's what empire is. And early Americans knew that. And when they achieved independence, they looked west and said empire. A little bit north, not so much, but south and west. And they said, that's empire. So the job to expand, to always be moving out, to capture more, is an imperial idea. And it should shape our sense of when we become dutiful citizens, members of the military, members of corporations, members of educational institutions. We always keep our eye on not pursuing an imperial design for its own sake and for the sake of the nation, but thinking that something else higher is calling us.
Okay, thank you. Empire is a biblical category, as you alluded to, Assyrians, Romans, Babylonians. Relate that to your analysis of nations and nationalism today.
So biblical view is that empires, nations are always threats and dangerous. I mean, that empires are always dangerous things. There's no good empires in the Bible.
Even Cyrus, huh?
Cyrus is only good because he freed the people of Israel and had a little bit of an anti-imperial moment, and he was replacing the previous empire. So they're okay.
I mean, he's the one they used to support, who.
Correct. So my sense is, biblical view is that empires are almost inevitable, and they go. Read the book of Revelation, the succession of empires, and they all are destroyed. The most politically revolutionary document in the Bible is the book of Revelation. The empire is destined, the empire, which is, Rome at the time, is destined to be obliterated. It is destined for destruction. And I think that ought to shape our sense of what we are as a nation and what we give ourselves to. I'm very appreciative and grateful for people who serve in the military. I'm not a pacifist. I'm close at times, but I'm not really a pacifist. I think there ought to be a military, and we need that. And when my pacifist friends hear me say that, they say, like what? And I say, like the Second World War. So,
okay. Great. This is sort of related to the decline of empires. Why do you say that the USA will die someday? And is that the same for other countries?
Yeah, it is the same for other countries. I say the USA die. That's a metaphor that doesn't quite work. But my sense is that nations and national boundaries and all we are, that part of our nationhood will be replaced by kingdom of God. And kingdom is kind of the reign of God, might be better, right? The universal reign of God. And nations, as this is Calvin now, nations are temporary arrangements to keep us from killing each other. The sword is there, and nations are there to keep us from killing each other and to keep human sin from running amok. So they're okay, but they're temporary, according to Calvin, and according to Valeri, too.
He keeps good company. I mean, you keep good company.
Yeah, I don't belong in that company, but I'll say,
Very good. Some current thinkers and political figures, this is kind of a counter question. They enjoin us to love America and Americans over other peoples. Is this a false choice, better than nothing, or a cruel justification, I think is the word?
There's a great line from, I mentioned the name Richard Mouw, M-O-U-W, has a book on Christian patriotism. It's a little too patriotic for my taste, but it's still a really good book. You know what I mean by that. I say I believe patriotism is a good thing, but he has a little too much of the. But anyways, he says in that book, look, this is how to answer this question. I love my mother more than I can love any other woman in the world. That doesn't mean my mother is better than all the other women in the world. That make sense?
Well, not to me, but
No. Logically, did that answer make sense to you? The answer to the question?
I do
love my
mom.
mother more than anyone else in the world. That does not mean my mother is better than all the other women in the world.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Now, this is kind of the counter proposal, and that is America is a really good thing. The larger America and the power it influences, the better the Americans impact the world, and supporting America, grandiosity and dominance is a good thing. What do you think about that?
I don't like its international implications. I don't like its militaristic expansivist implications. I think that America was a wonderful, how can one say this without sounding silly? That this is a beautiful, great nation we belong to. Its origins have these breaking through Augustinian moments of love breaking through. That does not mean that I think America ought to think of itself as a world power that's always expanding. I do think it ought to think of itself as protecting other nations. I don't know that America is somehow any more deserving than, I don't know, Norway. I just picked that one out of the hat as a democratically oriented nation that probably has a better healthcare and social service system than we do. In some ways.
The word dominion was used in there. What about dominion theology and its roots, Rashidi and others, and their Kuyperian bent?
Yes.
Kuyper was a very famous Reformed theologian, but they are using them in a very, very, very extreme way, I think, maybe.
Yeah, and
Thoughts
actually,
about how to take on dominion theology.
So dominion theology is that a lot of Old Testament texts that talk about the people of God taking dominion and control over the institutions. Why? Because divine teaching as given to the people of Israel is true and right and better than all pagan teaching. And because it's true and right and better than pagan teaching, which is vicious and unjust, America ought to the Christian teaching, biblical teaching ought to control all the institutions of society. A Christian education system is better than a non-Christian education system. A Christian health center, all these different institutions. The trouble with that is twofold. One is that not all Americans are Christians. Not all Americans understand the Christian tradition in the same way. We have obviously neighbors and friends who belong to different religious traditions or no religious tradition. And the trouble with dominion theology, A, is it excludes those people from places of belonging and power and flourishing. The second thing is that it misconstrues the clarity. It thinks that the Christian tradition is really clear and obvious about the solution to tough problems. And to go back to Augustine, and there's a writer from Princeton University named Eric Gregory, who writes the best things about what Augustinian politics is. And Gregory says, Augustine knew this: the church doesn't do politics very well. The church just does not do politics very well. And so that, taking that insight into account, I think that the dominion theology is not only exclusivistic of our non-Christian neighbors, but it also overestimates the ability of the church to do politics well.
Great, thank you. This batch of questions is about our global vision as Reformed Christians, and it follows right on this question. You said the Reformed experience should focus on the international and the international Christian community. What about other faith traditions? Should we focus on them too or not?
Should we focus on them? We should know about them. We should affirm their human flourishing and well-being. I do think that Christians have a belongingness to Christian traditions and movements across the world in a different way than they do to other religious traditions throughout the world. And I think that is a good thing. I think that the trouble with a global universalizing, it doesn't matter which religious tradition you belong to, I want to affirm you, that's a good thing, but it doesn't have much of a sense of community and belonging. Can I give you, do I have time for, did I use my 2 minutes?
You got 30 seconds.
As director of the center, I brought a scholar to Washington University named Tahar Aziz, who's a Muslim and a fairly strong pro-Palestinian thinker. I brought her to campus 2 years ago, 1 year, in the middle of the Palestinian protests on campus, when universities were clamping down on anti-Israel Gaza incursion protests. And I brought her, and she actually gave a very reasonable October 7th or 6th. 7th was really a bad thing, and I'm not pro-Hamas, but what's happening to the Palestinians, it was a very middle-of-the-road talk. Interestingly enough, I got some blowback for bringing a Muslim to campus, for bringing a kind of radical Palestinian thinker to campus. Okay. I also had 3 Muslim students come up to me after the talk and said this: I did not know if I had a place at WashU. Huh? Now I do.
There you go. Thank you. Regarding
belonging, yeah.
Regarding the global kind of worldwide Christian movement, what are examples of how to engage with them constructively? Or to be a part of the movement constructively?
How to be a part of that? That is a very good question. I think learn, be in touch. I think read, know, visit, pray for, learn about. I don't have a great answer to that one. Nancy might have a better answer to this one than I do. Any other suggestions?
Partner in missions.
Partner in missions.
Happening in Sudan, Somalia right now.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if it's too cumbersome to get a whole church to go to Honduras or Tanzania or whatever, bring those people here and learn and realize that's my brother, that's my sister, and that's the beginning.
This is a question about more traditional types of global mission. Does loving all humans presume the spread of Christianity to the world, to the places where it does not exist or is not predominant?
It includes that. It includes that. It doesn't, it's not necessary for that, but I think that bringing the gospel to people who aren't Christians can be a humane, loving, good thing when done rightly and well, and with compassion and with understanding, and with not a heavy dose of critique, but an invitation, a gracious invitation to be a part. I think that's really, really good. I think that is totally appropriate. So that's my answer.
Clarify the role of Christian missionaries to date in the independence movements and serving countries, for example, in Africa.
So again, that was my comment on Dana Roberts, who's a missiologist. Anything that she's written is worth reading. She teaches at Boston University. And this was a talk that she gave in which she talked about the fact that when the Christian missions began in different African regions, they began to, number one, is encourage those people to think about their history and their belonging and what was happening as they became Christian. And she said sort of naturally out of that came a sense of self-communal worth, identity of belonging to this larger group, and that fed the creation of national literature. This is the history of the Yoruba people. This is the history of the Kikuyu people. And they began to write those, and it included some aspect of becoming Christian, but it encouraged a sense of not having to defer to colonial powers and to breaking away from them.
I'm going to take a hand vote, friends. We are near our published time. How many would like to keep going? Okay, I think that's a clear majority. So if you need to leave, feel free to do so.
Can
Aaron,
I leave?
Aaron, are you okay? No, you can't. No. Okay, okay. Aaron has some final words for us as well. Okay, so we're getting down to the and the international question. I do want to include this one, since we have a little time. How do we respond to as Reformed Christians? How do we assess the history of immigration in this country? Its ups and downs, in the 1920s, clamping down. But more importantly, how do we respond now, theologically, et cetera, to the immigration issue here? 2.5 minutes. I know it's a tough question.
With humanity, with generosity, with not worrying about this will mess up our economic system, I think that's a false fear. I think with a sense of not being terribly violent in the way we respond to immigrants and immigration, I think that is definitely the Reformed thing. I think that this is a pretty clear answer to this one, is openness. And yet, Reformed doctrine of sin, yes, there's sin in everyone, and we need to be careful for how we are alert to nefarious incursions into the country. But I think the Reformed perspective is all of humanity, and therefore welcoming and not worrying about the fact that they're going to be taking jobs or some such thing. I think that's a false fear.
Okay. We're getting down to praxis now. What do we do besides learning and thinking? Yeah, like right now, what do we do beyond that? And part two of that, are protests part of our tradition?
The second part's really interesting. So what do we do, learn and think? I'm a college professor. I think that's the best way to start, and we can stay there. And pastors, mission workers, people like that are probably better at what we do, but I think it means one of the great benefits of being in a good, strong church is that when you go, I want to do something, but I don't know how to. That's what a church is for, is getting you involved and connected and flowing into the how to. What was the other part of this?
Doctor Professor who thinks and talks, but I would need your opinion. Is it part of the Reformed tradition to engage in protests?
Oh, protests. Not much. I have to say. Civil rights movement, yes. The word Protestant, by the way, comes from the fact that in Germany, when the Lutheran Reformation spread, there was a town, I forget the name of the town or city, which outlawed Protestantism. And the first time the word protest was used, when there was a street march and parade against the local law outlawing Lutheran teaching, and they were called Protestants because they were protesting. That's where the name came from. But I don't think, someone help me on this.
What about Calvin's endorsing of Jean d'Albret's son to ride the white horse into battle against the French? He was a Huguenot, a Protestant, and they were in battle with the kingdom trying to suppress them.
Yes, defensive military actions don't strike me as a form of protest.
All right.
But that is a better one, yes. So protesting against slavery, what do you want to say to that one? Oh, I was just... The what? Oh, Indigenous American rights and protests for that. Yeah. I don't have a great answer to that. Because obviously I first thought I don't see it, but we're coming up with places where there are possibilities and more chances to do that. Thank you.
Okay.
It's interesting because I think of protest as a visible public expression, and I think of resistance as somehow longer term and more calculated. And I think the Reformed tradition is really good on resistance.
Okay, good. Are there other ways that Reformed Christians can take action peacefully, standing up for justice and mercy?
Other ways than what?
Protest, armed revolution, and whatever you just said. Oh, resistance. Or does that sum it up?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is Reformed Christians ought to be involved in democratic politics as much as possible. Yeah. I mean, that's a blessing that we have, but being involved in democratic politics. I know too many college students who think of politics as somehow contrary to their aspirations for life, and I think we need to recover that.
What about the option of a common language? You mentioned that in the early days of the nation, and is this something that we should still support in trying to build a common language for this country?
No.
Why not?
You're a good teacher, Larry. I grew up in Los Angeles. We were all mandated through high school to study Spanish. At least my school district did. My sense is that I grew up without thinking that the Americans have a language called English. My sense is when I grew up, Americans had two languages, English and Spanish. I think that Americans are some of the most unilingual people in the whole world. Right?
Some of them can't even pronounce it, like where I grew up. if you know what I mean.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's my answer.
Okay, then. Good.
I'm trying to be really brief.
This is a question I misunderstood at first, but I think I get it now. And it's related to part of perhaps the agenda of some Christian nationalists. A Christian ecosystem as national law can or should or will the church propose a Christian ecosystem to be drafted into law? That's not an ecology question, is it, David? You didn't write that one. Okay, I want to pick you up. Oh,
Yes.
okay. And did you mean ecology or Christian culture system? Okay, okay. Ecosystem culturally and socially. Okay, okay. Yeah. Is it part of our tradition to have that, or is it something we should be promoting?
Yes, it is something we have had, and it's something we ought to promote, but I'll tell you where it plays out. One of the things that Calvin did in Geneva is he had universal, robust, poor relief in education. Public education and public poor relief. People flooded into Geneva, especially refugees from France, because they knew they'd be taken care of. As I would tell my students, if I was in the middle of the 17th century and you had to plop me down somewhere on a time machine, I'd want to end up in New England. And they all go, oh, you know, witchcraft trials, and the Puritans were kind of bad people. I said, yeah, but I would have been fed and given whatever health care was available. That is a universal Christian culture, is mercy and compassion. And I just said, I believed in evangelization and missions. I'm not denigrating that, but I'm saying for our common culture, it's a culture of compassion and caring and provision, and not a culture of you must individually earn your way and make your way through without the support of a system, because systems do make that kind of, we're all equal. I actually like Adam Smith. I teach a course that focuses on Adam Smith, and Adam Smith was really interesting. He's known as the kind of father of modern economy and an apologist for laissez-faire capitalist stuff. Smith was really big on equality of what you would say opportunity. And he basically said, I like this free market system, but if everyone has equal chance, he believed in public education, he believed in public health care. He actually believed in public parks. Adam Smith was really big on public parks, that we all can have access to this healthy thing. So that's my response to that.
Okay. This is a kind of sum-up question about where we stand as Reformed Christians. Catholics have asked me this, and in my ecumenical work, it comes from a number of different traditions. These two theological axioms have informed a lot of the Christian church's thinking. Grace respects nature, and faith respects reason. Grace and nature, faith and reason. And often that's used for grounding separation of church and state. How much do these theological axioms inform Reformed perspective?
Oh, gosh. That is, you know, okay, so my honest answer.
3 minutes.
No, honest answer, that's very debated. That's a highly debated point with Reformed theology. There is no Reformed perspective on the relation between grace and nature, on the relation between faith and reason. There are some thinkers, have you heard of Cornelius Van Til?
Yes.
Right? He and other people had debates about that very question. So I don't think there is a single Reformed answer. In other words, how our Christian thought and lives and biblical convictions, how they relate to other things. Nature as it comes to us, our natural beings, or the culture around us, notions of reason, that's highly debated. I tend to fall on the side of reason and nature as being important instruments of God's teaching us in the environment in which we move. But that's really one side of the Reformed perspective. It's the side I think that's most helpful.
Okay, very good. Let's hear it for, we didn't get to all your questions, but let's hear it for our speaker. To conclude, I invite Reverend Aaron Folk-Eichstadt here, as he's the president of the Reformed Institute.
So I will not take long, and Mark, thank you so much. That was such a great presentation, and thanks for the way you use your head and your heart. That's something that we do as Reformed Christians. We use our heads and we use our hearts, and we like to come to places and actually get a chance to think about how our faith makes a difference in our lives and in our world. And in a time like this especially, it matters how we think and how we talk about God, and that informs how we act in the world, right? And I love the way you ended your presentation, the first part, by saying, keep learning, keep reading, keep thinking. That's what we do. That's the mission, really, of the Reformed Institute. And you have a chance to support it. If your church is already a member church of the Reformed Institute, congratulations, thank you. Make sure your church gets its annual pledge in. If you are not a member of a church that is already a supporting church of the Reformed Institute, talk to your pastors, talk to your education committee, and see if you might join. There are also opportunities to give individually, and I just lay that out there because if we don't ask, we might not receive. So just hear that as a encouragement. And let's pray. Loving God, thank you so much for this tradition, which particularly emphasizes our intellect and pairs it with our heart and our action. Thank you for Dr. Valeri's presentation. Thank you for the way it made us think. Thank you for the way it moved us. Thank you for the way it may inspire us to action in a time when our voices are really needed. We pray your blessing on this institute, on these folks gathered here today, on our nation, and on our world. Help us to keep you first. We pray this all in your name. Amen. Oh, yeah, sorry. Blair wanted to, yes, well, yeah, January 24th is the convocation, and Larry will talk more about that. But on October 25th at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church at 2 o'clock, we're going to be having Paul Rauschenbusch come as our theologian in residence to deliver a lecture on Christian nationalism and our response to that. And Paul Rauschenbusch is a Baptist, but he grew up Presbyterian.
Rauschenbusch will also be at a public event that weekend, and we will make sure you get that notice. It's entitled Faith in Authoritarian Times. He does not mince words, very powerful speaker. But at the convocation, we will be addressing similar issues as today. This is a theme for the year that the board has chosen, Christianity and Patriotism. And so we are narrowing down our guests to come and speak. Oh, my goodness. He said yes. Do you want to tell them about him?
Last night. So our convocation speaker is a professor at Wheaton College, a theologian named Vince Baycoat. And he is going to be addressing the Seven Mountains Mandate, as well as dominion theology and those types of, that strain of thought from the Reformed perspective, and including some of the Dutch theologians like Kuyper, who are sort of hijacked by dominion theology in an inappropriate way. And so we will be doing a drill down into that and other topics. And Vince is very good at that. So we're very excited to have him.
We'll make sure all of you get notices about these events. One last request: if you're on the board of the Reformed Institute, please come up here. We have an opportunity for you. Just get out your checkbooks and that's another request. But we do have an opportunity for you today, and we thank you all for being here.